So, as a disclaimer, as a white passing person of color, there's going to be a lot of things that about the way that the SJM verse handles racism, or ACOTAR and specifically handles racism, that I'm not necessarily going to be able to speak on in any level of experience or even knowledge, to be honest. But I do think that there are things about the way that ACOTAR handles race that really do need to be addressed. First I feel like, just because it's the most relevant to the future, I feel like dealing in Azriel's internalized racism is gonna be really choppy because of the way that the Illyrians have been portrayed and the way that Azriel is kind of situated there. Like there's just a lot of things that are gonna need to be unpacked in a book with Azriel in it, and I feel like the book series as it is now is not necessarily going to be able to deal with the nuances of Azriel's of his internalized racism, where he like hates being Illyrian and he hates the Illyrian culture, but also he is Illyrian. And there's also like this level of deconstructionism and kind of unpacking your religious beliefs and your like established cultural beliefs with Azriel that might not be dealt with in any meaningful way, which would make me sad. But this is not the thing that people talk about when it comes to like the racism in this story. For that, I think we need to start with Illyria and the way that race is kind of portrayed in a fantastical way versus like a real life, like person of color versus like white person way. So there's this thing going on in the fandom where, especially in the theorist community, where people were like, oh, an ACOTAR 6, like with Gwyn as the main character, this has nothing to do with Gwyn as a character herself. I love Gwyn. But there's this whole thing where it's like, oh, like Gwyn and Azriel are going to go and fix up Illyria. They're going to like teach them better ways of like going about things, and they're going to straighten out Illyria, and that's going to be like the Gwynreal plot line. And that never really rang true to me because Emerie is right there. There's no reason for a story about cleaning up a society of color the main characters need to be a white girl and a guy who has a lot of internalized racism towards that culture. Like it's just not respectful to that culture. There's also this whole thing where Emerie is a person of color who has been oppressed for being a woman in her society, for being an independent business running woman of her society, who has had her wings clipped, which is like a very strange, like female mutilation thing that I don't necessarily have the knowledge to speak on. But when we talk about like fantastical racism in this fandom, we don't always gravitate towards Emerie. We gravitate towards Gwyn, and Gwyn being a quarter nymph and people like denigrating her for that, which is also wrong. But it's kind of like Gwyn's issues with racism. It's kind of like, oh, we need to make this easy for white people to understand, and this cute redheaded girl dealing with racism is like, they'll understand that as like the horror that it is. Meanwhile, we have a person of color who has had horrible things happen to her as a result of her race and gender, and we just don't think about her in the same way because she's not part of the ship war. This isn't something that I can deal with in any meaningful way, but I feel like there's also a level of kind of ickiness when it comes to all of the Archer ancestors being paired up with men of color, but then we're not kind of dealing with that in any meaningful way, to my recollection. But I'm not the person to talk to about that. There's definitely creators on TikTok who have spoken about that in way better, more eloquent, succinct terms than I ever could. Another thing we need to talk about is the Court of Nightmares and Illyria not really having access to Valaris, where Illyria, there's definitely like a more straightforward racism kind of arc there, but it's also mired in enough fantastical racism that the message gets a little bit muddled. The Court of Nightmares, though, this is when we're going to get really dicey and really topical. So the thing about the Court of Nightmares is that it's a place that is considered to be like an evil place full of evil people. Amarantha used it as inspiration for like her lair under the mountain. Then meanwhile, Valaris is this secret city on a hill where everybody is good, and this is kind of like a bastion of goodness in the Night Court that is secret from the rest of the world. And then when Valaris is found out about, Rhysand and Feyre, they sit down with Keir, and Keir is just like, I want to see this place. I want space. And then Feyre says something like, you have every comfort. And Keir just doesn't even dignify it with an answer. And the book frames it like Keir is being dismissive of Feyre because she's young and she's high lady and he doesn't respect her. But in reality, it's kind of like, girl, like, you just got here. You just got here, and we have never left this mountain. And then when the Court of Nightmares, they hammer out their whole deal, they're going to be able to visit Velaris. Then Rhysand sets it up with the people of Velaris, like, don't give these people any service. Do not deal with them in any positive way. Just, they're not here. Just lock them out. And, like, that's just so fucking wrong. Like, especially because we know that the place does have good people in it because Morrigan exists. Morrigan is framed as a good person, and they went out of their way to save her from the Court of Nightmares and her family and all of that. But then they don't stop to think that there are other women in the Court of Nightmares that need that kind of rescue as well. Like, how many Morrigans are still in the Hewn City? And I have never said out loud that, you know, the Night Court is an apartheid state, but I know other people have, and I don't disagree with them. And it's something that you would notice if you're, you know, paying attention to current events that I don't normally talk about on here. But like, it's something that as soon as you see it, you can't unsee it. And then the next thing you know, you're so sad for the people of the Court of Nightmares, especially because of the way that the way that the Night Court is set up. The Court of Nightmares and Illyria are like the only places that you know of in the Night Court, and the only places that they themselves know of in the Night Court. So how do they pay taxes? What's the tithe like? Does Velaris pay the tithe? And if they don't, are the Court of Nightmares and Illyria, are they stretching themselves thin to the point where they have to hand out blankets on the holidays in Illyria to cover up the funding of Velaris? Of course Keir wants to see this city. He might have paid for it. And like, I know we're not really meant to think about ACOTAR that deeply. Like, this is a story where these three women are going to bang their winged men with a fantasy backdrop. Like, we know this. But like, it's a thing where I think if you're going to engage with this kind of material, like Sarah's material, The Fourth Wing, apparently TJ Klune sucks. I didn't know that. J.K. Rowling's another one, I think, where I think if you're going to engage in this material, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You can separate the art from the artist. But I think you do need to know the problematic material. And it, once you can point it out, you're not necessarily going to be as influenced by it, you know? Anyway, this is a not even remotely comprehensive view of the inherent racism that takes place in ACOTAR and in the fandom. And there are definitely people way more educated and way more eloquent than I am who can talk about this. And I think that is good things to engage in, because there's nothing wrong with being critical about your media. And I hope that this helped, and I hope that I don't come off like too strong or like I'm being too accusatory or anything. But I really do hope that I answered your question.